After nearly 100 years of isolation in the mountains above Unicoi County, the town of Lost Cove could no longer maintain itself. In part 2 of her story, Kate Nemrich explains what led to the fall of a once thriving town, a proud Appalachian people.
A self-sufficient town, bolstered at times by moonshine and the timber industry, eventually began to fade. Lost Cove dwindled to just the ruins and memories that remain today. Not much stands of the town of Lost Cove, that at its peak was home to nearly 100 people. For many years, residents depended mostly on themselves.
Of course, they raised cattle and chickens, and they had hogs, and they, had their resources like that they lived from, and they grew gardens, of course. My grandfather John had a little apple orchard.
Timber and the railroad brought in more residents who raised families in the Cove.
The outside world started trickling in because they could no longer ride a passenger train, right? They could no longer use the timber because all of it had been depleted.
Paved roads never reached into Lost Cove. The end of passenger trains made getting in and out of town more difficult. Even with the train, visitors had to hike into town. Without it, the trek became even longer.
And it was hard for people to get back and forth, and they had to either walk to Poplar, North Carolina for supplies, or walk to Irwin.
Roy Guthrie's father had moved in for timber. When it dwindled, he moved out in search of new work.
Newport News in the shipyard.
Teresa Miller Bowman's father and his brothers turned to the military. In 1957, the school closed due to consolidation in Yancey County, forcing students to leave the town for an education.
Isaiah Bailey was one of the last ones in 11th grade, and in his 12th grade season he had to go to B-Log school. So he had to actually walk out of Lost Cove.
Medical care also had to be brought in or sought outside the Cove.
They would call in a doctor if needed, and a lot of times you could see an attending doctor. Now whether that was here or whether that might have been in Burnsville or Spruce Pine or somewhere like that, where there was a hospital or a doctor at.
At times, illness was devastating. Guthrie lost both his mother and youngest brother to tuberculosis.
And when my mother died, I was 3. And Odell was 15 months.
Both Guthrie's mother Trula and brother Odell are buried up in Lost Cove. Tuberculosis and meningitis took others in the Cove as well.
Bonnie was 16 when she died. She died from tuberculosis. Nola Tipton, she died at around 1 year old. I think it was meningitis.
In time, it became too hard to stay.
I think they loved their way of life there and they hated to leave, but it just got too hard to make a living.
According to Smith, Isaiah Bailey's family was the last to leave Lost Cove in 1957. She says no one truly believed it was a permanent goodbye.
Almost everybody left their stoves, left their beds, left, tables and chairs in their houses because they always thought that they would come back.
For years, many made trips back into the town.
We would go back in and just stay there like for a week's vacation or something. We'd get out and walk around and look at all the places and talk about the old times.
Eventually, vandals, fire, and fallen trees took their toll. Only 2 homes still stand. Stone foundations and chimneys mark where others once stood. The hand-built town.
I think this house was probably built in the late 20s, early 30s. A lot of them built their houses out of the timber that they, cut.
Reclaimed by nature.
I don't think this house will be standing more than a year or 2.
Descendants pushing to share the town's memory before it completely disappears.
Anything in history is important, to my opinion. And that's something, that's a place that won't never come back.
Sharing the memories and pride of their relatives.
They were very hard-working, self-sufficient, resourceful people. And I'm just very proud of them.
If you would like to know more about the history and fall of Lost Cove, Christy Smith recently published a book titled Lost Cove, North Carolina, A Portrait of a Vanished Appalachian Community, 1864 to 1957.